Coveting, scheming, robbing. It is the tripartite way that Micah shows in his book of prophecies that people use to rob people. And particularly, he applies this in his third chapter to the rulers and to the governments of the people. We'll talk a little bit about that today, more on the Gary DeMar Show. Hi again and welcome. I'm Joel McDurmon, hosting the Gary DeMar Show today, and we're talking about coveting, scheming, and robbing, as it was pronounced a woe among the people by the prophet Micah. This is exactly what people do. They covet other people's property. They figure out, they scheme, they find ways to take it under the guise of legality in most cases, and then they take it, which the Bible calls robbing. Just yesterday we were talking about the size of the national debt and how big of a joke and a PR stunt it is of the administration to say we're trying to cut back the deficit by $20 billion when the amount that they're borrowing every year is closing in on $2 trillion. Cutting back 1% of what you are already digging the hole is not much of a savings at all, and actually to call it savings is a joke. There was an analysis done by Sprott Asset Management, a gentleman there. He has a newsletter called Markets at a Glance. It's free to get online. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says all the time, but this analysis is very interesting in that he goes over the issue of the debt. And I'm not talking about the overall national debt. I'm talking about the amount we're pouring on it every year. $200 trillion, $200 million in 2008 and 2009 as well. The question is, who in the world is buying this debt? In other words, who is funding this binge that the United States is on? And he broke down the numbers. According to the Treasury's own report for 2009, at least for the first three quarters, $1.885 trillion was borrowed. The first group, there were three groups that borrowed this much. The first was foreign and international buyers. We think particularly of China, the one we hear most of in the news today. $697.5 billion. The second group was the Federal Reserve itself, the old classic counterfeiting scheme in which the Treasury goes to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve prints the money out of thin air, gives it to the Treasury, and the Treasury is supposed to pay it back with interest. And it didn't exist to begin with. $286 billion borrowed by the Federal Reserve. But then there's this third group who is amorphously called by the Treasury, quote, other investors. After purchasing $90 billion from the Treasury in 2008, this same group bumped up its amount over 5 times to $510 billion in 1 year, 2009. And this raises the question, who are these other investors that the Treasury is getting this money from? Well, there are definitions in the literature. They do list people. There are individuals, government-sponsored enterprises, brokers, dealers, banks, personal trust, estates, corporate and non-corporate businesses, individuals, and other investors. It's interesting they have other investors listed in the category of other investors. So we go down the list. How much did each one of these groups borrow? Well, it turns out that that entire list of people borrowed a wash, some of them sold actually, borrowed a wash of $16 billion, a pittance compared to the overall $500 billion. Stick with me now, this is where it gets interesting. Who is the group there is carrying the lion's share of this amorphous amount of money that has appeared on the Treasury's balance sheets? And the answer is, quote, the household sector. Now this is supposed to be a catch-all category that does consider private investing. It does consider domestic hedge funds, which is actually a small percentage of them. It does not include the big banks like mutual funds, ETFs, life insurance companies, and all that kind of stuff. What is the point? The point is when it's all hashed out, when you really sit down and analyze it, the household sector has nothing to do with you people at home. It has nothing to do with household debts. It has everything to do with just being a catch-all category for the Treasury. And in fact, they say it is calculated as a residual. In other words, they calculate up all the debt that people owe them, or they owe to other people, however it works. Either way, they put it together, they run the total, they get down to the bottom of the line, and something doesn't add up. They have to say, well, we need a category to make this add up. And so they create a category, household sector, and well, all this other stuff we can't account for, we put over here. It's kind of like the particle physicist, the quantum physicist, trying to find the Higgs boson, a particle that so far no one has ever seen, and yet they've spent billions of dollars trying to find it because their equations won't balance out. And so they have to believe it exists. They can't say, well, maybe our equations are wrong after all. We got to go find and justify ourselves. Well, the banking is doing the same thing. We can't account for this $500 billion that showed up on our accounts. So we'll just say so-and-so out there borrowed it, and then we're justified in still spending it. So they answered the question, Sprott says, who is the household sector? They're a phantom. They don't exist. They merely serve to balance the ledger in the Federal Reserve's flow of funds report. The fact that the Federal Reserve, they say, and U.S. Treasury cannot identify the second largest buyer of Treasury securities this year proves that the traditional buyers are not keeping pace with the U.S. government's deficit spending. It makes us wonder if it's all just a Ponzi scheme. Ponzi scheme may not be the most apt way to describe it, but it is a scheme. It is fishy. Who knows? There are other alternatives out there, people trying to answer this question, but no one really can answer it yet definitively. Every other proposed answer seems to be something that is not even close, not even really possible. So it does seem like the Treasury is cooking its own books, creating a category in which to put more, perhaps, Federal Reserve money and spend more when they can't find buyers for it. It's $500 billion. If that's true, then we wonder how this can continue, this scheme can continue. It is a way for the government to covet, scheme, and rob, as Micah says. I support the Transparency of the Fed Amendment bill that's in Congress. I hope it passes. And I hope something is done to audit these guys and bring some honesty to the monetary system. It would be a step closer to a biblical system. And perhaps we can talk about that more at another time. Thank you for joining me today on the Gary DeMar Show. Don't let the government covet, scheme, and rob. Call your congressmen and senators, say you want to audit the Fed, that you're behind the bill. And join us again next time here on the Gary DeMar Show.
For more related to today's topic, check out Protecting Your Wealth from Liberal Fallacies, featuring Joel McDurmon. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.
Feels good.